Okay, I'm going to pop out of here in just a moment and hand it over to Chris, who's going to be acting as the moderator for this panel discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. So we look forward to this discussion, and I think that's what we're hoping to accomplish. First, we've got this label of enterprise, and I think that for the folks who are viewing this that may be fuzzy on what enterprise means, Ben, what would you say enterprise means to you as a differentiator from non-enterprise?
It's a good question because I don't think there's a very clear delimiter between sort of enterprise or maybe slightly smaller business or startup. But I think, so I was thinking about this talk, there were a couple of general principles that came to mind. So I'll sort of lay out the three that most immediately stuck out to me. The first was around scale. So, the data team that we have and the users that we support at JetBlue is a pretty large audience. So I think that when we're talking about enterprise, we're generally talking about a number of users that engage with our data platform, sometimes beyond the community that we immediately know. There are people who use Snowflake and the products of our DBT work who I don't even know on a personal level because we're a large company. One of the ways that we might be able to differentiate is based on usage of those data platforms. So I'm curious to hear in the Slack how many sort of daily, weekly, monthly active users you have across your BI tools and across maybe your data warehouse as well, because I think that might help us draw a bit of a line. So I think scale is the first one. The second one is the diversity of needs and users that we have to serve. I think sometimes in smaller companies, you have a pretty clear audience or maybe a single stakeholder, maybe two. At JetBlue, we have dozens and dozens of stakeholders that have competing interests, different ways of looking at the same metrics and same data, competing priorities and data sources they want to have integrated and modeled. And lastly, and this is maybe what defines enterprise to a certain extent best, is a certain level of controls that are in place. So, I hope everybody has strong IT or security frameworks in place, but we have, a large, serious security team, and it introduces, more steps in the process. Sometimes that looks a little bit more like bureaucracy, but I think that when there's large enterprises have to be more risk averse at times than startups. And with that security also comes compliance. So we have processes that we need to follow. And all of that contributes to, this definition of being an enterprise company, I feel.
Yeah. So Ryan, what would you say would define, a company that is definitely not an enterprise company?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of an interesting inverse to Ben's statements, right? I almost feel like I just have to repeat him. I mean, if you have a very limited set of users where, you basically immediately know everybody who's going to be putting their hands on the process of creating content or consuming that content, you're probably not an enterprise. And then I'd like to echo Ben's statement again with what are the levels of control that you have. If you're a publicly traded company and you're subject to SOX controls, for example, you're an enterprise, and you're going to have a whole other set of considerations that don't apply at a small startup.
So, I think that there's also, if we take the Venn diagram of enterprise and non-enterprise, there's a point in the middle, of course, where there's some overlap there, because you can have, I have customers that are publicly traded that have one person on their BI team to support 1,000 users. And so while there's only one person in that hierarchy of how do I implement this thing, there's still the complexity of, we have an obligation to report every quarter on what our earnings were and that sort of thing. So Amy, if you look at this label of enterprise, is it relevant? Is it a defining sort of, this is how we should approach our business, or is it irrelevant?
Yeah, I think in terms of DBT, it comes into play in two ways. Where it's relevant, as everyone's mentioned, it's about scalability. It's so much easier to implement DBT at like a very flexible new startup, maybe with a data team of one, than a large company that might have like over 100 analysts that all work very siloed, and they're used to that being stuck in their own business unit. They don't talk to each other. So with like any implementation, you have to think about buy-in, but rather than a few folks, you're looking at a lot more red tape. And there's also the added benefit of potentially having to change a lot of dated mindsets. I think what's really cool about this is it's not relevant in terms of the code. code that I've written for enterprise clients and startup companies actually at the core looks the same. The majority of our best practices still hold up. And what's really exciting about like a SQL-based tool is at the end of the day, it's just SQL. I actually just recently took code that I wrote for a startup company and gave it to an enterprise client, and they just implemented basically word for word. So while there are like some minor tweaks, like how you've organized Snowflake databases, or maybe the SQL in your database is slightly different, at the end of the day, the code doesn't look different. It's not a completely different language, and you're basically doing the same transformations.
So to put a bow on that aspect of it, what, to everyone, what are some of the problems that you would face in an enterprise that you wouldn't necessarily have to deal with in a smaller company, whether it's a startup or not? Anyone can jump in on this.
I mean, I think one of the biggest things is simply the designing of the processes that need to be put in place to manage things according to a larger enterprise's change control standards. That's kind of the most obvious thing, like what Ben hit on earlier, but also the process of sort of driving adoption and standardization of action across a larger enterprise is very different, right? So it's very easy when you and the guy that's sat next to you are doing the work together, and you can swivel the chairs and ask a question and probably come to an informal best practice, right?
Yeah.
But as soon as you start to scale out and you look at a community that's much larger, I think that we have something like around 30 people that are contributing to the DBT code base at Chesapeake. To have 30 people contributing in a consistent way that produces consistent products and consistent in the forms of the content, the context, and the actual shape of the data that's being delivered, I think takes a whole lot more work. And when I talk to people about rolling out something to larger groups, I think that's the thing that stands out to me all the time is how do you develop those processes and best practices and develop maturity in a user base.
Yeah.
If I can weigh in, I mean, I think some of the problems that we face, to piggyback on Ryan's comments, often has to do with limitations in how quickly we can change things. And as a result of that, there's also sort of, we're often a little bit less able to experiment. So if an enterprise is going to take the time, the security reviews, the legal reviews, all these processes that involve either bringing in a new product, or even if it's changing an internal process, it takes a lot of time. There's many hours, weeks and weeks, and maybe sometimes months invested in getting to that point. And so, one of the challenges that we have at enterprises is we have to be a little bit more confident in the bets that we make, because it's hard for me to spend many months deciding, we should use DBT, and then decide, actually, no, we should go use some other tool, or hey, we should use Snowflake, and then change our minds. Most of the times, the bets that we make have a longer lifetime value within the organization because the switching costs are so high. So I think that's one of the typical challenges that maybe a startup with a group of very engaged users, like on a dime, say we're going to switch which data warehouse we use or change which tool we'd like to use. The other piece that I would highlight at enterprise as well, exists everywhere, but I think exacerbated, is the difficulty in building consensus. I think about this particularly in terms of everything from naming conventions to data modeling approaches. As we talked about, the folks in revenue management might see something differently from the folks in accounting. And being this as a data team, a data engineering function, you really have to work with everybody. You're really the center of a lot of people's universes on a daily basis, just given the data that we touch. And I think that is particularly challenging at the enterprise as well.
Yeah, I think the amount of folks you have to involve in to just decide on a tool and also just implement the tool is sometimes mind-blowing still to me, where it's like, why are there 20 people on this Microsoft Teams call when only one person is speaking? But that's because you need everyone to get on the same page and be on board to say yes. I think one of the things that I found most challenging implementations is data democracy. It's often a new concept to a lot of folks, and I find so much pushback when I'm saying, yeah, people should have access to this. You should empower people they should see the documentation, even if it's just seeing the SQL. They don't need Snowflake access. They just need to be able to read the documentation. And that has been surprising to me to some degree of like, no, why did you say no to me for that?
Yeah. So it's, we're all familiar with the term shadow IT, which is usually something that folks don't deal with in smaller organizations. But in big companies, you also have shadow experts, folks that may not even be in the stream of the work that's being done, that suddenly pop up that have some perceived expertise against either a technology, a process, or whatever it is. And the disruption capability of these types of folks, you can't overlook it when you're planning through the stages of these rollouts. But okay, so I think we've got a pretty clear understanding of what the enterprise is and how we differentiate it. So Ryan, as you introduced me to DBT, and I'll be forever grateful for that. I'll take that to the grave. What problems within Chesapeake were you trying to address when you began your journey with DBT?
Yeah, I think that really we could break these into a couple different categories, right? First of all, we had a very classical, centrally managed data warehouse team. And I want to be careful and say that that was successful for the company for a very long time. We built a very large warehouse that was the backbone of many processes in the company. I believe at one time we closed our general ledger via the data warehouse, right? So it was part of our control process. It was very mature. But I think that there are a lot of things that have been going on in the industry over the last 5 to 10 years, and we start to see a movement towards more of an agile development process. And I think that comes from a lot of work that happened in the open source community with trying to discover a way to allow more people to contribute to projects and still allow them to be governed. So there's kind of a cultural shift that's been happening. This idea, and we see it everywhere, honestly, that more people should be able to contribute to the value pool or the value chain. The other one was that technology has changed a lot also in the last, probably really like the last 5 years, where I looked at a chart recently that was showing compute capacity over the last 60 years. And there's a big uptick in the 1990s, and there's another huge uptick in the 2010s, between probably 2013 and 2016. And that was really cloud coming online and making a lot more compute capacity available to businesses. And so we're starting to see some unique technology capabilities in there. And I think those two things sort of merged in a sense, this idea of saying, hey, the technology seems to have enough capability now that we don't have to have highly specialized, highly technical people building very complex workflows in scheduling utilities and tools like Power Center and tuning Oracle schemas and doing all of this stuff to deliver data that people can consume, right? So right there, the technology took a big burden out of the barrier to entry to just simply participate in the data value chain. And then the notion that I talked about earlier with more of the democratization coming out of the open source paradigms of using repos and pull requests and processes like that really allows more people to participate in that. And so, I think we looked at the centralized warehouse model. We knew that model wasn't going to be able to meet the demand in terms of the amount of information that needs to be delivered, and it wasn't very good at meeting the variability of the consumer's needs. And so it seemed pretty clear to us that we need to look for a new operating model, a new paradigm to operate under. And so, stepping back and thinking about that, we were kind of able to marry together those technology capabilities and process capabilities and say, let's take this out into the organization and start to change the way that people interact with data as a value chain.
Great. I absolutely share, I think, everything that you said there. As we look at sort of an existing data warehouse, an existing, information stack that's functional, right? The company's been using it for 10 years. They invested trillions of dollars in it. Well, maybe not quite that much, but it seemed like it at the time. With a battalion of people, it involved everybody across the organization. It was one of those, 36-month implementations from the days gone by when companies could do that. And, you've got this sunk cost in it. what sort of signals, other than the things that Ryan's already mentioned, performance and things like that, would you look for, to say, hey, this might be a good time for us to jump into the DBT pool here?
Well, there is that right saying, like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think in enterprises, that is often like a guiding principle, which is like, it works, don't touch it. You're introducing a lot of risk if you want to start messing with, tables that, get reported through accounting, right? You start to take on quite a bit of risk, or for an airline, our on-time performance, right? Like, those numbers have to be exact and they've got to match to several decimal points. There's not a lot. It's not very forgiving if we're going to make a change along those lines. So I think from the enterprise perspective, there has to be a bit of an acute pain. If you have an existing data warehouse with a really well thought out data model, everything works quite well, you really have to think hard about, do I want to upgrade? I think where it becomes a much easier decision is when you need like a radical data transformation. And I think that the way you can kind of know that is through what Ryan mentioned, like big challenges with performance, or just knowing that the infrastructure you've invested in and tooling you've invested in is legacy, and you don't really need to ask your users, you just know it yourself. But I do think that from the outside of like that technical side, I think we have to put ourselves frequently in the shoes of our users. And for me, in prior roles as an analyst, I was always most bothered, extremely bothered, by lack of documentation and problems with data quality. I would much rather have here's my hot take, I would much rather have a data model that was maybe poorly thought out than not having access to knowing how that was built. I needed to understand, what did you filter on, right? What does this table mean? I can kind of undo that on my own as an analyst and kind of make it work. But if I don't have that piece to it, I'm extremely blind. And Chris helped us out when we were sort of in the early stages of developing our architecture at JetBlue. And we spent a lot of times sitting down in meetings, doing interviews, not with a browser open, looking at the data warehouse, literally sitting down, having face-to-face conversations and asking people about, how do your processes work? What's automated and what do you do manually today? And you can glean a lot of information from those kinds of conversations about how the business is hurting. But the problem that you'll also run into is that when things are the same or maybe suboptimal for a while, people learn to live in that new normal, right? Our data warehouse was down for maintenance so that we could load our data from 11 p.m. to basically 9 a.m. every morning. So people got used to starting to run their queries at 9:30 when the data warehouse got back online. That should not happen in 2020, right? We expect 99.9% availability, not 60% availability. But that wasn't even maybe the top concern that people raised, as much as that might surprise you. So I think that there's really this question about the technical implementation and having an honest assessment about whether your tooling is really limiting you, but then complementing that with real conversations with the business, with your business users, and asking them what it is that they need, even if they're not asking for it directly.
Yeah. Yeah, we've always done it that way. We're used to it. All of those sort of, settling types of commentary that we get from folks is culturally doesn't help us get things across the line, but it does indicate, a lot of challenges that we might face in addition to the obvious ones of cost and performance and scalability, that sort of thing.
I think I'd add to that comment, Chris, when you say, well, a lot of times the users will say, we've always done it this way, that they were often working around things that IT could not deliver for some reason.
Yeah.
And that's one place where we've seen a lot of value is in processes that the business was involved in that I refer to as manulating data, right? That the process which nominally would be automated, but is fully manual today. So we have people who manulate. And I think providing them with the location where we can take a lot of those processes that are manual, allow the data to be consolidated, and provide them a way to go and provide efficient access to the information that they need, where it can be obtained efficiently and consistently, and at the same time build some process rigor around it that can prove that the way that data is is produced consistently is a huge value add to the organization. So I think that was one of the biggest things for us, was that we simply had a way to open the doors and socialize this data access in a different way. And I keep using that term, get more people involved in the value chain. And in doing so, you really dramatically decrease the risk to the organization, because if somebody from the Department of Manulation leaves, then suddenly we're unable to perform that business function again, right? And so having a system like this where you have more people participating in a way that leaves key artifacts, whether it's in the term, whether it's as been described in something that is documented and we can tell how it works. And that could be simply by looking at the repo or the code base, or looking at the documentation that may or may not be included in the DBT project. Having those things, those artifacts living in your organization de-risks the organization itself. And I think that's an important topic to understand.
Yeah. So back in your Informatica days, you wouldn't just send people to the repo?
Well, back in the Informatica days, we didn't have people building their own things, right? And so instead we had people emailing Excel files around of maybe data extracted from system A, B, and C, and then the manulator that I keep talking about would put it all together.
Yeah, we get you trying to get that to stick, and I'm kind of digging it, honestly. So Amy, this is a tough one for you, but we have some signals for, hey, we need to look at DBT. We need to implement DBT. We need to do something different. Are there signals that would say, we probably should not do DBT? We should not jump into the pool?
Yeah, my viewpoint here is like, it's not so much of a tech problem. It's more of like a mindset issue. You actually have to be willing to embrace that modern stack in its entirety, and also be very honest with yourself and acknowledge those pain points that Ben and Ryan both experienced. I think there's a very interesting place to be here right now in the DBT community, where there are a lot of people who are seeing the hype about DBT and they're like feeding into it. It's like the latest flashy thing. But there's also a problem where, and you can see it in like DBT beginners, any of those channels, where there are people who they want to use DBT, but they essentially want to use it in the same way as their old transformation tool. I have seen a lot of folks essentially pick and choose what the best practices are. Like they'll implement tests, but maybe the code in their models aren't idempotent, and they hold a lot of that historical burden. And with those projects, it sucks to say, but I can essentially see where they're going to break in the future. Like I could probably give you a timeline of like, that's when that's going to fail, because what you're basically doing is a lift and shift and moving to best practices, but you're essentially overall just dragging your skeletons to another closet. So even though you might be paying less in your entire stack, those costs are going to add up really quickly. And this is a lesser so issue, but because I'm on like sales calls, I have also gotten like pushback on the fact that DBT is not like a GUI based tool, or that it's SQL based. We definitely have tried to lower the barriers to entry with like things like the ID, just so it's really easy to get in it. But we still hold very strongly to our views that analytics should be code and SQL is powerful and performant. There are, unfortunately, language snobs is what I like to call them, where they believe that Python is literally the only way to do proper analytics. And because we're recorded, I'm not going to express those negative thoughts outwardly. So like overall, I just think like you just need to be willing to commit and like potentially be uncomfortable for a bit, because this is a new way of doing things. You need to think about very programmatically how to implement it, but in the end, it'll be worth it.
Yeah, that's great feedback. I think that we look at what the steps are, and we're going to talk about, Ben and Ryan's implementation strategies, and I think the experience that Amy and I have had going through implementation strategies. But we know there are hurdles that we have to overcome. We know that there are obstacles. Some of those come from no culture, where you've got organizations that love to be obstructive, and that's a defensive position that especially technicians take to preserve the skills that they have, and because change is hard and it hurts, and and all the reasons that we know about just from an emotional reaction. What are some of the hurdles that Ryan and Ben, that you have had to overcome in your implementations at the onset. We can't jump in the pool yet. We've got to put on our bathing suit. We've got to, put some sunscreen on. What are those things?
I'm happy to start with, one of the first steps before you even, get DBT in the door. And maybe it's a, touchy subject, but, in my role, I have to go get funding, right? At the end of the day, dollars have to be justified through a rigorous business case process. And, one of the hurdles in modernizing your data stack or bringing in tools like DBT can often be like, how do you really demonstrate ROI? It's something that I struggle with. And, I struggle to fall asleep at night thinking about how do I justify the ROI here? It's a hard calculus for me to say, like, I know everybody is going to be a lot more efficient. They're not going to run a query, wait 2 hours, go get a cup of coffee, lunch, breakfast, brunch, come back, and it'll still be running. And then they'll start their day, in the afternoon because you're waiting for data to load. So there's all these, like, I believe so strongly that it's just going to increase everybody's productivity across the board, but it can be a hurdle conveying that to, senior leadership in finance, for example. Even if they believe it, it's often hard to put the dollars to it to really justify the spend. So I think that's one challenge. Another challenge that you might face in an enterprise is, and you see this in all sorts of organizations, is people having been burned before, right? You have business user groups who've been promised things in the past. We're going to integrate this new data set for you. Then it takes 3 times as long as they expected. In the first month of rollout, there's a ton of data quality issues. They instantly lose trust, and they say, okay, we're going to go through this exercise yet again. I've already migrated my Tableau, Looker, blah, blah, blah reports twice before in the last 2 years. You're going to make me do it again to this new data model. And I just think that there's a healthy bit of skepticism because, like we were talking about earlier, there are real switching costs. The time that it takes those groups to do that work is time that they're not spending on something potentially more strategic, right? It really comes down to kind of cleaning up some technical debt to enable hopefully a lot of future successes, but maybe not instantly. So you have to sort of convey that future vision. The one thing I will say is that from the data engineering side, I thought that there were honestly very few hurdles internally. I personally, and I think that this is shared among the data engineers on my team, which is there's something about removing that abstraction layer between a GUI-based tool and writing the code yourself. And almost from like a morale perspective, in an engineering position, it feels good to write code. There's something about creating a feature branch, opening up a pull request, having that merged in, and you contributing to this asset for your company that's, I think, extremely rewarding. And I just don't get that same feeling of excitement, when that branch gets merged in, when you're using a GUI-based tool. It just doesn't, you don't feel like an engineer quite the same way. And so I love DBT, not only for the principles and all of the rest of it, but I actually do think it contributes to good morale as well. People feel like engineers, and it helps them adopt that cultural mindset that they need to be successful with the modern stack.
Yeah.
I think
Any thoughts?
I think one of the big challenges for us really was thinking about how to roll out something this large to this many users, this many departments. And there were a lot of decisions up front of when we do go and we need to provide self-service, how do we want to manage the risk of conflicting views of information? Because our business, there's a lot of segmentation where there are key business entities that really have conflicting usage across the company. I would imagine, at many companies this exists in different ways where there's different perspectives on what a consumer is or what a customer is. And there are legitimate conflicts on those things. And we have in the past really struggled with this monolithic enterprise approach and saying, hey, look, we can't do anything. We can't respond and publish anything until we can publish something that's true for everyone and everyone agrees on. And that in itself is an encumbrance to the company, right? That's something where you're effectively telling a department, hey, your department perspective doesn't matter. It's only the enterprise perspective can be served here. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we want to lay out Snowflake and DBT and manage this so that we're able to reflect the different consumer perspectives. And so I think really putting a lot of thought into that logical side of the architecture is important. And also going back and not forgetting why people use the legacy warehouse that you had. Right, Chris, you hit on that and you said, hey, you've got this thing, you've spent a bunch of time and years investing in it. People like it because they trust the data in it. You really do have to go back and don't forget the things that worked and pick apart those important features of the existing system and figure out how you're going to take the things that were good and bring them over into the new system. I think Ben mentioned data quality, right? How are you going to implement data quality in this new system? Do you need to design some area to sequester those data quality issues and make them visible to users so that when data is not in the final product, they can go and understand where it was filtered out and why? So I think, for me, it was not so much a discussion that was specific to DBT, because I feel like DBT is this wonderful thing that manages the code base. It was largely a discussion around the logical architecture of the warehouse itself, how we wanted to segment that architecture and manage the information inside the smaller warehouses that the domains or departments are using. And so we really front-ended a lot of the design process with addressing those concerns. I think that once we got past that, things started going relatively smoothly. I would say that, and we'll probably revisit this point in a few minutes, but then the next steps really are in that socializing things and trying to get people to understand how to use the system effectively and efficiently.
So I think Ryan started to address this, so I'm going to start this with Ben and eventually wrap it around the whole crew here. But if your implementation strategy could be on the left-hand side, just dabbling in, I've got a new data mart or a new sort of analysis that I would like to start with, and that's how I'm going to bring DBT into my organization, over to full on kill off the old, re-implement everything in DBT. Ben, what was the strategy that you applied to first get DBT into your organization? And now that you're into it, is that the strategy that you would recommend?
So we did more of the second one that you gave, the second example that you gave. When we looked at our existing data warehouse, we saw this as an opportunity for a few things. One, we had a whole lot of stuff and we didn't know how it worked. It just hadn't broken in a while, or when it breaks, we know the part where it usually breaks, but sort of that enterprise knowledge had left with people coming and going over the years. And so we actually looked at this modernization effort as a way to rewrite it all from scratch. No more camel case columns. We went down to dusted off old documentation, and we saw this as an opportunity to clean up our technical debt. And we refactored every single pipeline was rewritten. This was pulling out SSIS jobs, Informatica jobs, stored procedures, rewriting it in a more consistent way. Amy knows about some of my problems with CTEs. And now that I have a platform, I'll say sometimes CTEs aren't actually that good. That'll be the hottest take of the conference, I'm sure. But we saw this as an opportunity to refactor. And what I'll also add to that as well is we refactored our DBT project as we wrote our DBT project throughout the course of the year. I think some of the best use of resources that my team had was about a month and a half or 2 months in, we actually asked Fishtown to audit our DBT project, their professional services arm, to basically say like, hey, look at our project. Does this look right to you? Like, where are we doing things that aren't that smart? Because now we might lose the forest for the trees because we're so deep into it. And I think you constantly have to be asking yourself that question. And I think sometimes that was a problem with the way pipelines were developed in the past, because it was such an individualized activity, right? Somebody built a pipeline by themselves, they test it, they handed it off to QA, QA validates that it works, but nobody really looked at the guts. You only cared about the output of it. And I think one of the healthiest things that we've done is constantly questioned, is this the right decision? oh, we want to change our naming convention for our file names. That seems like a real headache, but we're going to go ahead and do it because I don't want to live with this for 5 more years. So, our implementation was more of a, let's start anew, let's take this opportunity. And of course we had to, and we are still maintaining, hopefully by the end of this month, we will shut down our old system which will entirely be replaced with Snowflake and DBT. But it's been a really healthy exercise. And I think we've tried not to cut any corners in that process. Every model has corresponding documentation. Every model has corresponding tests. PR isn't accepted without that. So I think you can start small scale, though I think it may be easier to sell your users sometimes when the change is a bit more dramatic. They feel it more. And the other thing that I'll say as well is that one of the challenges we have with data is that you often need multiple data sets, right, in order to get the output that you're interested in for your analysis. So as agile minded as we are, sometimes you need to build out 3 or 4 data sets to get the output that the user is interested in. And to a certain extent, that's a little bit more of a waterfall model. So I think that that's something that we've really had to think about quite a lot as well, when to actually open up the floodgates or not.
Yeah, I think that we were sort of, hearing Ben's story, sort of in a similar situation. We had actually several legacy systems. Chris and I can laugh about this. In our environment as a whole, we had this very large Oracle data warehouse. It was the enterprise system. We had Cloudera that was being used by a certain set of customers, and we have HANA as well. And I think the main goal and really the ROI was really easy to justify on the Cloudera end, because the spend had become pretty high, and we were able to pretty quickly demonstrate that we could offer similar services at a much lower cost with Snowflake and DBT. So the ROI was kind of taken care of there. And so, the real first wave of bringing things into Snowflake was associated with that Cloudera retirement. And going back to Ben's point, of a certain number of data sets needing to be there to be useful, it was fairly easy to look at some scope of usage and say, oh, here's a set of core objects that need to be available for anybody to start finding value in this system, right? So understanding your business and the data sets that are typically needed, I think really gives the central team a chance to come forward, produce enough data capital, if you will, publish enough data capital for the users to be able to come in and understand how they can make incremental changes and start using the system.
Amy, you want to add anything?
No, I think.
No.
Yeah,
So I think that I'll say this, there is no wrong way to get a foothold of DBT in an organization. I think Ryan was talking about that at the end a bit. Having done this a whole bunch of times at a bunch of different companies, there are ways that may be a bit smoother. There are ways that may be a bit more jagged, but at the end of the day, this is such a good, clean technology for companies that have come from that legacy world of ETL and big box ETL tools, that once folks see the value and the benefits from DBT, then it's either immediate or they're almost never going to get it, and I think that most folks are in the immediate camp, and and the other folks will eventually come over the fence. But start small, start big. There's the cost value case, whatever business case you can make to get it going, whether it's black ops or it's a full-on ROI case. Once it's there, I think the value becomes quite evident. So we're running out of time as we expected, and I don't know if Claire can extend us. Maybe that's too much of an ask, but instead of that, we're going to jump ahead a little bit. So as we're talking about here, the paradigm shift from traditional ETL tools over to DBT can be really, really daunting. For folks that have been working in these tools for 15, 20 years, they have a mindset, they have an approach, they know it like the back of their hand. Amy, what are ways that you think that this transition can be facilitated or made smooth or made as easy as it can be?
Yeah, this is definitely not like surprising in any way. I don't think I'm going to announce anything like this is the magical unicorn. It really boils down to like proper training and professional guidance. Like that, it's really key to making sure like folks coming from like career informatica, the old paradigm, shifting here, they just need to be comfortable. That's actually one of the reasons why I'm a strong believer in a bottom-up approach rather than a like top-down approach to implementing DBT. Once you get the developers understanding what this tool is and how it makes it better, they tend to be the better DBT champions than say the like some exec telling them like, hey, this you need to implement this and use it. So in terms of like proper training and professional guidance, the implementations I basically lose the least amount of sleep over are the ones that like there are folks like you, Chris, who are on the ground doing the work, but also like helping guide that project flow and just making sure you're answering the questions appropriately. This is because like our training plug for DBT Learn and Jumpstart, it really builds up the foundation, but it really helps to have someone who's like putting up the windows of your house to like help you put up the next one. So basically go to DBT Learn and also look for help. The other piece, I hope no one feels uncomfortable with me plugging myself, but I've also played therapist and trainer. Like for all of our enterprise clients, just because of how the contract is structured, I've spent time just like jumping on a call to help debug and or speaking very high level about project configurations. This is because we know that once you get in the door, once you feel confident, you'll know where to take it from. And in order to do that, you have to make sure both the project stakeholders and also the developers are in a good state to make sure that everyone's essentially rowing the canoe like forward. I find myself as the awkward tour guide into like DBT Slack community, just being like, hey, go into the community, go look at things. People are asking the same questions. Just because you're enterprise doesn't mean no one else is asking that question. And also just like that personal touch tends to make it a little bit more viable because you like here, there's a lot of value being heard, but you need to actually like get into the weeds and understand like what's going on, especially because most of the time when you're getting into DBT, you're not just buying DBT, you're learning about Snowflake, learning about Fivetran. So you kind of need to know like how everything fits together because none of these tools are siloed anymore.
Yeah. That's great, Claire. Ben, what should a team look like at the beginning of an implementation? What are the essential sort of, pieces of a team that you need at the beginning? And then as the team starts to mature, what do you think a team should look like?
So our team at JetBlue has an interesting structure where we actually have a fairly small JetBlue crew member, JetBlue employee based in our data engineering team. And we work a lot with business partners who work offshore. And so we have this interesting challenge where hours can be different at times and sharing knowledge can be at times a little bit difficult, and we have to be really intentional about it. Probably similar to the way that a lot of companies now that are like fully remote, you have to spend a lot more time focused on communication altogether. But what we did was, what our team, I think the biggest challenge at the enterprise is that you still have to keep the machine running while you're building the new one, right? And yet you don't want a team of engineers to feel like, hey, you get to use the new stuff and while the rest of you maintain the old stuff, right? So you want everybody learning, but at the same time, we have responsibilities. We have reports that need to go out. Our data warehouse for a while was giving us a bunch of challenges and we had to stay on top of those. We have users that are still filing bugs for data quality issues in existing tables. So I think the way that you start is you try to get sort of that core part of your repo built out, a couple of the data sets that people might get excited about within the data engineering community and have them all learn from that example. So I don't think you need to start with like everybody on the team starting with their own feature branch, et cetera. I often think that the best way to learn is to look at a good product that's been created. And I think there you can benefit from bringing in people who've done this before, right? If it's your first time, your first DBT model probably isn't going to be your best one, right? So bring in somebody or partner with somebody who's seen this before and then kind of grow in that organic fashion. But I think you have to make sure not to exclude anybody. And you also have to make sure that you don't try and set everybody going all at once. And if I can almost commandeer your question a little bit, one of the things that I'm eager to hear about amongst this group, but also in the Slack channel as well, is about how people think about opening up their DBT projects, particularly at the enterprise, to their analyst community, right? We are still at the point, even though we've got 30 odd contributors to our repo, we're still keeping it fairly tight within IT because we still feel like we're building out these foundational models. And I think if we're going to model flight data or passenger data, that probably ought to be done largely by us, but we don't know how we might want to represent it after the fact or sort of the variations of that data. So my mindset, and I'm curious if people have other ways of thinking, is sort of as the core team, we're responsible for building out this foundational layer. And I think the analyst community may get more involved on building on top of that. But yeah, I'm also curious to hear some of those thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Ryan, the final question for this illustrious panel is, having been through your own implementation, what would you do differently now with the knowledge that you have, either from a technical or an organizational or a cultural sort of perspective?
Yeah, I think the thing that probably jumps out to me most at this point is sort of related to what Ben was saying, that there are certain things that I think we did really well, that we were closely involved and provided a lot of support to the user community. And I remember we were in during and early in the implementation, spending time with the manager of our accounting COE, and he would be in the sub basement with me for hours, and we would be talking about some model that he wants to build and what the process would be around that and the type of testing that he can build into the project so that he can be reasonably assured that the data that he's using is accurate. And he was a great partner, right? And so I think that was one thing that has worked really well for us, are choosing those people that have the technical skills in the business to really jump in, participate in it, develop things, see value. And I think that's gone exceptionally well. What I think we may have missed on is really rolling out the best practices to them and having the central team enforce those best practices better. And so I think you really need to look at the operating model that you're going to use and figure out what does it really mean if we talk about a continuum of distributed development versus shared services versus a centralized team. There's a lot, that's a big span, and there are some nuanced choices between each of those. I think that, really for us, going from centralized services to shared wasn't the goal, or from just purely distributed or self-service development. I think we really should have thought a lot more about what it means to be a shared services team and what the role of the shared services team should be in the development process. Specifically, I think we should have been a lot more willing to step forward and say, look, I know the idea is to allow the business to do some of these things faster and be more agile, but anything that the user creates is really the property and the responsibility of the company as a whole, right? It's not Ben's project or Chris's project, it's the company's project. And the company is responsible for owning that and sustaining it over time in the event that that person leaves. And so really getting in and being willing to inject ourselves more into that pull request process and look at that as an opportunity to train those people so that they can make better products and the company can sustain those products over time. I think that that's really the biggest thing that we missed, and is the thing that we're likely to go back and revisit.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I think that wraps it all up for us. I want to thank all of you. You've done a great job, and I look forward to continuing this in Slack. So back to Claire.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris.